This picture out here sort of represents, it's a sort of classic picture of migration. People on a train. In fact, a lot of people look at this picture and think it is about partition. Because partition has these iconic images of people fleeing on a train. And if you see this picture closely, there are actually, if you count the number of people in this picture, there are almost about 80 people in that small sort of frame. And most of them are men in this particular picture. Virtually every adult woman in India today and in the past has been or is a migrant, right? And so the census gets you a number over 300 million women, okay, for the simple reason of marriage. But this is important to understand, because when we talk about India's diversity, and the first chapter of this book talks about diversity, is how did India become such a diverse place? You could have many roots to it. You could have a diversity which is built on isolation. Okay, many of us are very proud that India has many languages, but actually Papua New Guinea is a small sort of country which has more languages than India. And it's because none of those islands sort of spoke to each other, and so each language developed on its own. Is Indian diversity a result of isolated pockets throughout history not being connected and just forced into unification in the recent sort of time period? Or is it a result of migration? What you would see in a train, say in New York City, where just you have the whole world represented in a sort of a railway coach. I argue that Indian diversity is about migration, and a large part of that migration, what Nehru called, the invisible threads that hold Indian diversity. I start by arguing that these invisible threads are held through these marriage migrants. And we don't often realize it, but almost when we think of marriage migrants, especially village to village, that is rural to rural migration, often these are at short distances, but they sort of blend or they transfer the culture of a particular place to another place at very, very small and slow gradients. And that is why what we heard earlier in terms of the Karnataka-Maharashtra border, right? And it's very interesting because if you see a map of female migration in India, interstate, it's almost completely along state borders, right? And that's because people marry and then they move. They just happen to be on another line, but in effect, it's the same region. And that's how Indian diversity sort of has been formed, because of very strict marriage rules. This is not very unique, but in India, very distinct for its persistence, or what we call, or sociologists would call as village exogamy. That is, you move upon marriage, right? And you move, and you also return, right, for sort of childbirth, for social functions. And in a way, you can see India as this web of concentric circles, where each village is tied with villages around through marriage relations. But not just villages and cities, right? Now, these concentric circles, of course, differ because these marriages never almost tend to cross caste or religion boundaries, right? And for the last 2,000 years, India has been, or maybe earlier, but we know for a fact now through genetic studies that for the last 2,000 years, India has been arguably the most endogamous society in the world. So it's a diversity where people move, but are moving within particular concentric circles built primarily in India on caste. So if you look at the India Human Development Survey, for example, it shows you that even today, the survey was done a few years back, about 94% of Indians, even today, marry within the same caste. Right? And caste is a very sort of narrow social group. There's not that much of a difference in this statistic in rural and urban areas. Okay? So this is an interesting way to think about migration, because what I argue in this book is that, A, India has an incredibly rich and long history of migration. I will argue that India has the world's largest voluntary migration stream, what I've called as the Great Indian Migration Wave. But what's interesting is that this migration has often been circular, and it's interesting just to give a passing reference that the two great epics of India, the central theme in both the Ramayana and the Mahabharata is one of exile and return. This idea of circulation is so strongly built in Indian culture, and you see it even today in various forms of migration. But this history, this persistence, this sort of long durée of migration has not affected all groups evenly. And so some social groups have been less spatially mobile than others, and that matters even today. And finally, I argue that migration is a prerequisite for maintaining India's pluralistic sort of traditions. So what I'll do out here, in the book, the book starts off with this Aryan migration hypothesis. There's a very good book by Tony Joseph called Early Indians, which has come on that subject. So I won't talk about that. I'll start with this idea of, again, female migration, because the most dominant. Almost every Indian woman, adult woman we are saying, is a migrant in India. And what do we know about this form of migration, women's migration in India, in history? And I'll start with just some ideas about this coming from the Arthashastra, which is a very, very ancient text. We still don't really know who compiled the Arthashastra. Some guy, Kautilya, Chanakya, but historians will disagree. All we can say is that it was compiled around, roughly about 1800 years ago. But the Arthashastra is remarkable because it gives you detailed sort of notes on who can move and who can't move. And it's remarkable on what it has to say there on women's mobility. And if you read the Arthashastra, you realize it's a society at that time based, pretty much the women are dependent on men. Women have a lot of sort of liberties and movement, but on the whole, it is curtailed. So you have clear injunctions on what women need to be doing when the men are away from the house. You have clear injunctions, for example, that women cannot leave the house when the husband, or the wife cannot leave when the husband is drunk or asleep. These are clear injunctions which are coming from the Arthashastra. You also have special privileges for mobility. And so, for example, Brahmins don't need to pay ferry charges when they cross the river. In fact, it is a punishable offense even if you ask the Brahmin to pay the ferry charge. Right? So these forms of privileges as to who can move and who can't are actually enshrined in many of the texts, Arthashastra being one sort of representative. So starting with this view, if you thought that India or the world was, you had this idea of free mobility before the passport came along, it's actually not very true. Some forms of curtailment of mobility have always been there. Mia as a word for the outsider. But historically in India, very recently the word Firangi, before that the word Mlech, or it's a Sanskrit word. You'll see it even used in Odisha, for example, in day-to-day language. Someone who's come from outside, something impure. This idea of purity of who is your inside and outside. And much earlier, a word called Yavana to describe the Greeks, who are coming outside. So I have a description in this book on how these terms have sort of changed over time. Now you'll see how women's mobility has changed drastically from the times of the Arthashastra to the Mughal period and then much more recently. But I'll cut now to a much more recent period, as roughly about 500 years ago, and I'll start with this remarkable painting that we find. And the person out here was a major noble, you could say a major soldier, a major noble, not too far from here. As you can see, the color of his skin is black, and you have the descendants of this community portrayed as an exhibit today downstairs, so the Siddhi community. This particular man, by the name Malik Ambar, brought out by the historian Richard Eaton, is a remarkable sort of symbol of the possibilities of migration, coerced migration, switching to sort of non-coerced migration in one lifetime in sort of Mughal, not Mughal, but in early modern India. This painting represents many things. Here's a man who was born in Ethiopia, taken as a slave to the Arab world, and then from there as a slave to the Ahmednagar dynasty in what we would call as today Maharashtra, and then being freed, so he's no longer a slave, gets married, and then has a stunning rise in upward mobility. And this is in stark contrast with what you see in many slaveholding societies around the world. Now, why I'm starting with slavery is because in sort of human history, slavery has been one of the most important forms of coerced migration. And you often think that slavery is a sort of American notion, or most people who are slaves worked in America. But slaves have been described right from the times of Arthashastra. It's a global phenomenon. What you find in India, though, is these remarkable avenues for upward mobility for many of these slaves throughout history. These slaves are not necessarily men. You also have a lot of female slaves. A lot of the armies, you had they were called literally reproductive pools, basically women kept to rear armies in varieties of kingdoms. These kingdoms include the Cholas in the south to varieties of kingdoms in the north. Since we talked about the Rohingyas today, very important to understand the history of that region. In the Arakan sort of region, which we saw in the morning today, what's interesting is that this was a major slave raiding zone of India, of the Indian subcontinent. And a lot of people from Bengal were taken as slaves once the Portuguese and the Dutch came in the Indonesian setting. And these guys were recruited from Bengal to the Arakan, to the kingdom out there, and then eventually found their way in Indonesia. Okay, so every region has a very fascinating history. And when you see the reverse migration today in the Arakan region, and you take this sort of time scale slightly back, you realize just how continuous in some form many of these migrations are. Now, here's cutting it to the 19th century. And this is a chart of, it's called the Hill Coolies landing at the Mauritius. And this is a chart depicting, Indian workers, often known as indentured workers, who landed up in Mauritius. It represents, in a way, the first organized recruitment of labor overseas. It's not the case that Indians didn't go overseas. But what the British did, especially as a sort of empire, as a rising empire in the 19th century, was that it changed mobility in very interesting ways. On the one hand, it increased mobility by transport, in this case in terms of ships taking people far and wide to the plantation world, but also, of course, through the railways. And we started with a photograph of the railways. We've seen documentaries today using the railways as a leitmotif. And I actually owe my existence as well to the railways because my parents met in the Bombay local train. So transport is a very important part, and the British do a lot to increase the speed of transport in India. But the British also did a lot of things which actually reduced migration, and that's actually very less known. For example, throughout history, India has had a lot of nomadic groups, a lot of groups which have always been on the move, especially groups in the logistics sector. Okay, the most famous being the Banjaras. If you go to Hyderabad, there's a posh area called the Banjara Hills, which is actually named after that. But the Banjaras are a particular group. They call actually different names for this group across India. Okay? And this is a group historically mobile, but becomes settled during British rule. And you'll find a lot of groups actually who face downward mobility because their historically acquired sort of mobility norms were sort of stripped away. And why did imperial powers not recognize these groups? Simply for the fact that mobility represented a sort of, a distraction. That is, if you could move from one place to the other, you could not really, put that person in one place and extract taxes out of that person. So it was very closely linked with land revenue settlements, with taxation. But as it turns out, many of these groups eventually got jobs with the transport sector itself. For example, on Dadar station, on the railway platform, many of the porters, even today, trace their ancestries to these groups who were first displaced, curtailed mobility, and then eventually working on the sort of figuratively platform of the technology which displaced them. This chart also represents an interesting thing because it has water in it. And throughout history meaning roughly about 1500 years, there's this very strong notion in India of the Kalapani. Okay? And this notion, it's still not really well researched. We still don't know when this notion started, but we do know that this notion was very strong in the 19th century. When Gandhi first went for his studies outside, he sort of had to placate his people saying, look, I will come back and nothing will happen to me. As recently as a decade ago, there was a temple priest competition in Udupi in the south, and the two priests trying to get the head priest position. And one priest said that this person has gone to the US, crossed the Kalapani, and so cannot be sort of considered for this position. That's how strong some of these norms are. Now, the Kalapani was interesting because the fundamental reason it existed was because of caste. That is, you could not observe caste rules outside India, and hence this notion of loss of caste upon return. Right? And so it had a very, very strong notion in many parts of India, not all parts of India. But it's precisely because of this notion that many people went abroad precisely in order to lose their caste. Right? So some people afraid of losing their caste, and some people desperate to shed away their caste. And this is important because in the 19th century, this is a very important moment. The freedom movement, actively works against this indentured labor migration. But as I argue, this migration stream was not just indenture. In fact, quantitatively, indentured migration was less than 10% of all the migrations. About 40 million Indians left between 1830s and the 1930s, and almost all of it was not indenture. So it represented something much more. It represented globalization and the opportunities that were available. It was, of course, exploitative at some extent, but it also represented a new possibility. And that's why so many Indians went. And if you see the Cricket World Cup today, if you see a sort of South Asian ethnicity represented in virtually every cricket team of the world, many of that is because of these migrations. This is a photograph, maybe you can't see it very clearly, but it again just shows the modes of traveling, this being the elephant, but other modes by different animals, even walking, and the arrival of the railways, which finally sort of creates this dramatic increase in mobility, in terms of the speed of mobility. But I argue in that book that the most important institution for migrant workers in India, especially, or migrants in general, has not been the railways. It has been the post office. And it's a remarkable history of how migrant workers across the subcontinent, across the world actually, deal with the post office. Of course, all of you heard the word money order. Today, nobody really uses much because it's got good competitors. But it started in 1880 in India. It had to very quickly change its practice. They found that most of the recipients were women because the men were working outside and sending back money. So India became the only country with home delivery of cash. So the post office had to completely reinvent itself because women were not coming to the post office to collect the cash. So the postman would actually go to the houses and deliver cash. And the system which basically lasted for more than 100 years. This pattern of male-dominated migration really kicks about in the 19th century. Of course, you have people migrating for wars, mainly male soldiers. You have pilgrims, which are also mostly male in many of the 17th and 18th century migrations. But this idea of work-related, male-dominated migration kicks about in the late 19th century in large numbers. And I argue that this migration still persists today. The abolishment of indentured migration did not stop these migrations. It changed the destinations, but the places which were sending these migrants out continue to do so. Just to put this in perspective, the world's largest migrations, if you think of them as epochs, one is called the age of mass migration. That is the migration of about 40 million, or actually 50 million people from Europe to America between 1870 and 1914. In fact, most of America today, the population traces its ancestry to this wave of migration. You think of slavery, 12 million slaves taken from Africa, mostly to Brazil, not North America, a massive coerced migration stream that took place for about 4 centuries. You think about urbanization in China today. China's urbanization rate went from about 20% 3 decades back to over 50%. That's one of the world's largest rural to urban migration streams that has ever existed. Compared to all of that, India's migration, which I argue is the Great Indian Migration Wave, is the world's largest and longest and mostly voluntary migration stream that has existed. So what is this migration wave all about? Who has it touched? And when you see some of these maps, you'll realize that many of us in this room are part of this very, very large wave. So the basic characteristics are male-dominated, semi-permanent. Semi-permanent means you don't eventually settle, but neither are you seasonal. There's a huge migration in India, many of the construction worker sites, which delve upon migrations of 2 to 3 month frequencies. These migrations are more at the sort of middle end. These are not usually the poorest of the poor from the village. Neither are they very rich. They're the middling castes in terms of social group representation, but they send back a lot of money. So we heard about remittances in the past, but I argue that a lot of India, not just Kerala, is a remittance economy. This is one representative family from this wave. This is taken from our fieldwork in the Konkan, and this is a family which the man worked all his life in Mumbai, in Chembur. This is the only time the family came to Chembur, and they got the photograph taken. But most of the women were in Ratnagiri. Ratnagiri is a district south of Mumbai. And he worked almost all his life in Mumbai, eventually went back to Ratnagiri to settle, and then his sons have sort of come here. This is actually a world record. And let me just give you an example with the help of sex ratios. India has remarkably adverse sex ratios. All of you heard of the phenomenon of missing women. India has sex ratios in many parts, 800 females to 1,000 males and so on. This is a phenomenon of the missing men. In Ratnagiri district, from the first census in 1870s till today, till 2001, it never had a sex ratio below 1,100 females to 1,000 males. Okay, just understand. I mean, we think of sex ratios in India, 800 to 900 females to 1,000 males. Here's a district of India, never seen this statistic drop below 1,100. And this is not just Ratnagiri. There are many districts of India, which especially when you look at age groups, have such remarkable, strong persistence. What this means is almost 5 or 6 generations of people who have moved to another place, worked all their life maybe out there, come back, and their children have continued to do the same. Okay, and if you go to these regions today, and I'll show you a map, what we are essentially seeing is migration histories of almost 130 years. Many of them, the destinations have changed, but the source regions are the same. In many of them, they have transformed from being poor places to rich places, but the migrations still continue. In many places, they have continued to remain poor. So I'll try and sort of delve upon why this has happened. This is another family. Again, you can't really see it very closely, but this is a family from Udupi district. Udupi district is one of those sex ratio record districts. I think 1,050, it has never had a sex ratio below 1,050 females to 1,000 males. That is the phenomenon of missing men. And you, of course, the major catchment area for both Ratnagiri and Udupi has been Mumbai. All of you know about the Udupi restaurants. Where did the cooks come from? Where did the labor come from? Mainly Udupi. Very few settle down in Mumbai. Okay, almost all of them that you see in the restaurant will actually go back. This photo is a rare family which did settle down in Mumbai. In fact, this is the terrace of a building next to the Bal Thakres in Shivaji Park. It happens to be my own family. And in fact, my father is, on this person out here, but he's been photoshopped because he wasn't born then. And he was feeling left out. So we sort of put him in this photograph out here. But this represents a type of a family which came to Mumbai in the 1960s. And it's interesting because actually our surname itself, Tumbe, sounds very Maharashtrian. There's a Tembe and a Tambe and so on. But we are actually the only Tumbes in the world. You can Google that if you don't believe me. There's a Tumble somewhere, but that's different. So the reason we changed our surname actually was precisely because different waves of anti-migrant sentiment, right? And so we were one of the South Indian migrants who sort of changed our surname to become more Maharashtrian. Right? And that's what migrants often do to try and fit in. You not only adopt certain customs, but you often also change your name. So this is the map. This kind of tells you what this great Indian migration wave is about. So this is Ratnagiri. All the red shaded districts, are in a way part of this massive wave. What is this wave? It's a wave of, starting in roughly the late 19th century, of mass male-dominated migration, sending back a lot of money, and it's semi-permanent in nature. You'll see almost the entire west coast, barring a small strip out here, is part of it. So it's not just Kerala. It's this entire stretch from Kanyakumari to Ratnagiri. Udupi is somewhere here. But even if you turn the corner, you'll find districts out here sending people, even people today. This is data from the National Sample Survey in 2007-8. It's 12 years old. But I would argue that the map would not change that drastically even if we had it today. There's serious data constraints that people working on migration have, and that's true. For example, the census 2011 data has not yet been released, and we'll probably have the next census in a couple of years. But what you'll see out here is this interesting pattern where middle India or central India has kind of been locked out, right? And so if you look at Mumbai's own migration map, which I'll show you next, you find people coming from UP, Bihar, etc. But who is a Madhya Pradeshi in Mumbai, right? And Madhya Pradesh is much closer. You would expect that you had more people if you thought of migration being purely based on distance. then you would find more people from Madhya Pradesh than Uttar Pradesh. And the answer, of course, is in how networks are created, of these ghettos which are created, of networks in jobs, of networks in marriages, etc. Now, in the book, I talk about 4 districts, and I've talked about 2, Ratnagiri and Udupi. And I should mention in passing, because the mango season is getting over, in 1930s, there was actually a legislative debate on, basically the ferries which used to come from the Konkan, from the Ratnagiri to Mumbai, they would carry both men and mangoes. And there was actually a legislative debate saying, the mangoes are taking too much space on the ferry, and so what should we be choosing? As I call it, Ratnagiri is famous for mangoes and mangoes. So both these things, it's got this terrific history in both. Now, this is another very fascinating district called Ganjam. And Ganjam has unfortunately faced a super cyclone, forget cyclone, a super cyclone virtually every 10 years. And if you see, it's remarkable how these cyclones, you think they're going to hit Tamil Nadu, eventually they zoom into Ganjam. It's just unfortunate for Ganjam that they get these cyclones again and again. But Ganjam, 100 years back, mass migration wave to Burma, and today almost everyone from Ganjam is migrant workers in Gujarat. Okay, so 100 years back, Burma was like the Gulf. We talked about the Gulf in the previous discussion. Burma was like the Gulf 100 years back. Rangoon was like Dubai. Okay, and a lot of Bombay's wealth actually came from Rangoon. A lot of famous merchants, diamond merchants especially, like Ketan Mehta, started their business in Rangoon. And so this was a huge belt of migration starting out there. And this is probably the most famous belt, right? And again, it's interesting when you look at history, because if you take a 2,000-year sweep, both the Mauryan and Gupta empires were based in that region, what we would call as Bihar. Right? 2 of the most famous migrants associated with that region are Buddha and the Mahavir. Right? And historically known for in-migration, but today known at least for the last 200, maybe 300 years for out-migration. So it also shows you how a region can switch from being a major hub where people are going towards to a place where people are moving away from. Okay, now I won't go into the reasons for that, that's there in the book, but it's not just Bihar, but it's also the eastern Uttar Pradesh. It's not all of Uttar Pradesh. The guys you'll see in Bombay, for example, almost all of them are from districts like Azamgarh or Jaunpur, but not really from this spot. Okay, so this is one continuous belt, and this is linked with climate. Just like you had cyclones for Ganjam, here you have basically bad flood controls even today, as a result of which a lot of migrants that you'll find out here, especially security guards, if you ask them, do you own land back home, they'll say yes, but what do I do, because it's often flooded. Right? So this Bombay is a much more secure job than working out there. Then you have Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand sends a lot of people out, and that also has a very long history, mainly through military recruitment. And then you have this huge belt, which is relatively more recent in Rajasthan. And you'll see these 4 circles here, which don't have any red in them. Those are India's seasonal migration hotspots. Okay, so for example, the organization Ajivika Bureau works mainly on this particular circle area, where you find a lot of migrants moving for much shorter frequencies, disproportionately from the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, working in especially very low skill end sectors in the urban labor markets. Then you have a cluster here, and a cluster here. Okay, so this is sort of a geography of India's labor migration. This is how Mumbai looks like. Okay, so this is India's map, but it's like a heat map. Where do people in Mumbai come from? Okay, and you'll see this huge blank in Madhya Pradesh, huge blanks in many parts of the northeast, Chhattisgarh, UP. Now this data is very old. The last time we got such data was in the 1990s, so it's 20 years hence. But again, I would argue that not much would have changed, because this just tells you relative intensities. And you'll see how certain districts are very strong. For example, from this eastern UP cluster, from Rajasthan, from Gujarat, especially Kutch, huge Kutchi population in Mumbai. And then you have this one district of Tamil Nadu called Tirunelveli. And almost all the Tamilians that you're going to see in Mumbai owe their origin to just one district, actually 1 or 2 blocks within a particular district. And that's pretty much how migrant corridors work. So a lot of my research was on particular corridors, particular trains of India, historically steamers plying along the west or eastern coast, carrying these migrants. In contrast is Delhi, which draws the bulk of its migration from the Gangetic Plain. Okay? And again, this is dated, so this map will change now, but it just shows you the contrast. When we say Mumbai is the most cosmopolitan city of India, Mumbai and Bangalore being the only major cities where no dominant language exists, which means no language commands more than 50% of speakers, Delhi is very different. It draws people from pretty much the major Gangetic heartland. And similarly, you'll see Kolkata not drawing people from anywhere today. Right? And historically, a major magnet, historically one of the largest cities of India, but today a city of net out migration. It also has remarkably low fertility. So it's that rare place in India where population is actually falling. Right? So India, population doesn't fall. Anywhere in India, population usually grows, but in many wards of Kolkata, the population of the urban wards is actually falling. So where are these guys going? You should ask your Bengali friends. They will tell you, pretty much the other major metropolitan cities of India. And this is Surat, a city I studied very closely, and a huge chunk of Surat comes from this one district, 1,000 kilometers away. They take this Puri Okha Express, one of the longest train rides of India, and come there. So this is how sort of networks are built. So it's not the case that you move to the nearest place, you move to where you have information about that place. And that's the most important thing about how migration works. Now, I've talked a bit about migration of labor, and much of my work later on, and now I work in a management school, is revolving around business history. So I'm going to talk just a few minutes not on the migration of labor, but on the migration of capital. And it's remarkable how India's wealth, or you can say the big businesses of India, even today, are concentrated in just 5 or 6 communities. Okay, just to give you a statistic, 70% of India's richest Indians belong to social groups comprising less than 1% of the population. Another statistic, take the 1,000 top companies, 10,000 directors on those companies, 45% of those directors are still Banya or Vaishya, one sort of caste spectrum. Again, very small population of India. And what's remarkable is how these communities, almost all of them are geographically clustered in 1 or 2 places. And the huge cluster is, of course, here. Right? And if you take the Parsis, well, out here, but Marwadis, Gujaratis, Sindhis, Kutchis, Punjabis. Okay, so we talked of Bollywood. A lot of that was starting with Khatri capital coming from Punjabi Khatris. You talk of Marwadi capital, hugely successful across India. Sindhi, probably the most transnational group, dislocated twice, not just by the partition. First 200 years back, that's how they first started moving, developing an identity, and then the partition shock. We documented one of a very interesting business house called House of Motwanis. You see any old photograph of Gandhi, Nehru, they speak with mics saying Chicago radio. And Chicago radio was built by the House of Motwanis. They migrated before partition. But they took the name of Chicago radio because they were importing from it. And so there's a sort of lesser known story of the freedom movement that Gandhiji's speeches on Swadeshi, which reached everyone, were through imported mics built by a migrant entrepreneur from Sindh. But what's interesting is the relevance of this is that if you think again of those concentric circles, the way information flows, the way capital flows, the way finances flow, it's the counterpart of this is how different communities are locked out of economic activities. Okay? And so, for example, if you were to look at Dalit business or Dalit capital, today it is still a very, very tiny fraction. Right? And that's one of the reasons is because the spatial network of many social groups in India are not as wide as many other groups which have had a head start in it. And so combine that with the statistic of low intercaste marriage, and what you get are different concentric circles. Some social groups which span the whole world, some social groups which are just around the village. And that is why migration, especially from rural to urban areas, or even international, is so important, if nothing, just to increase the size of that concentric circle. Because that enables more information on education, on jobs, on marriages, on a variety of things. So this is just to give you an idea of where Indians are outside India today. So we talked about internal migration, but what is happening to the world outside? Now, historically, Indians had 300 years back, almost all Indians outside India were in Burma, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. Now, of course, Burma was part of British India for a long time, so you might think it's not really outside India. But these were the main hotspots. Now, Burma, we've seen what's happened. A lot of Indians, not just the Rohingya, but before that, a lot of communities in India were thrown out. Just like you have NRI colonies in many cities of India. Today, in almost more than 20 cities of India, you have something called as Burma colonies. These are basically colonies of returned migrants who were thrown out of Burma about 60, 70 years back. Malaysia is a rare country where people are still going to and represents an old sort of plantation-led diaspora. Sri Lanka, actually, we have more refugees today from Sri Lanka. And South Africa, of course, famous Gandhi story. A lot of islands, the Caribbean now, because we're playing the World Cup, that has special significance. What's interesting in the old diaspora is that it was much more diverse in terms of social groups. So if you see the guys who went to these places, it was a spectrum of India which is quite representative of India. Okay. Whereas today's diaspora, I argue it's like a U-turn, the three U's, that is UAE, UK, and US, which commands most of India's migration, which commands most of India's overseas direct investment, which commands a lot of trading ties today, is the three U's. This UAE, UK, and US, even in terms of remittances coming from them. The diaspora there is much more homogeneous and represents a very different kind of representation of India. So for example, political scientist Devesh Kapoor and others have written this very nice book called The Other 1%. This is a book about Indians in the US, the 1%, inequality and so on. But Indians now form about 1% of the US population. So it's called the other 1%. And in America, Indians tend to outperform every other social group on almost every development indicator. But this is not necessarily because Indians are so smart or etc., but because the guys who went there were selected from a very top end of Indian society. Okay, so India's immigration stream has changed drastically from the old sort of diaspora. And that is why, for example, if you look at sort of Dalit activist circles, in addition to educate, agitate, and all the standard sort of Ambedkarite symbols, you also have migrate, right? Because it's very important to go outside and actually learn and break into existing networks. Out here, a very interesting country is Italy. Okay, and I spent a year out there. Italy now, after UK and Europe, has the largest Indian population in Europe. It's almost all Punjabis coming from one or two districts in Punjab, also part of the Great Indian Migration Wave. The famous the Punjabis who went to Hong Kong, to Canada. It's a very similar sort of migration ethic. And the guys in Italy sort of actually run the dairy sector of Italy. So if you go to Italy and have the cheese and so on, there are 200,000 Indians now in northern Italy. In Spain, you have a much smaller diaspora or immigrant stock. But what's interesting there is that it's a completely different caste profile. These are also guys from Punjab, but they belong to a particular sect called the Ravidasyas, or what sociologists would classify as a Dalit Punjabi diaspora in Spain. So Indian immigration today takes place at multiple levels, and again, strongly by networks. And even when we talk of the migration of capital, the new social groups in business, whether it's the Saurashtra Patels in the diamond business, or the Gaundars in Tirupur textiles, who are moving from sort of peasant or landowning structures to business, a lot of that is again from the same classical route, which is migration, right? But it's again the same migration, intra-marriage, keeping the capital within yourself and supporting others to come up through it. Okay, so it's a very interesting way how other social groups are now coming into business. Migration being a very, very strong component of that. There's of course migration for education, which we've not talked about throughout the day that much, but that's a huge number when you think about it. There are a lot of people now moving around for education. This is just an example of a passport in the early 20th century, 1934. This comes from the Godrej archives, which does wonderful work on business history. And you'll see how important the passport has become as a document to control movement. I argue in the book that, of course, this is a very powerful document, and its manifestation really comes about in the early 20th century. But if you think about who could move throughout history, you did not need the passport. It was always implicit that some people could move or had more privileges to move than others. And so passport is just a sort of recent manifestation of much older forms of surveillance and curtailment. It's just a photograph of some of the first Indians who landed on shores around the world. In 1700, you wouldn't find Indians, so many Indians anyways, in Europe, in North America, in Western Africa, or for that matter, South America. Today you do. And these represent, in a way, the sailors. Today we heard of a district called Mymensingh. Almost all the sort of, what you would call as Bangladeshi stock in UK today comes from that one district. In the case of the Pakistani diaspora of UK, almost all of that comes from one district called Mirpur. And Mirpur, Mymensingh, just like Hoshiarpur and Punjab, all belong to this great Indian migration wave. And often either military service or sailor, or people working on boats were the first guys who reached these different shores. Even in America, in New York, there's a whole diaspora of people, the first guys who jumped off the ship from there. This is a quick example of what Indians are doing outside India. And it's this remarkable photograph of just a head out of nowhere. And this is actually in Slovenia. And I love this photograph because it captures many elements of the Indian migrant sort of spirit today. One is, of course, that this guy reached Slovenia, and he has a thriving business. This is actually an Ayurvedic spa chamber, where he uses a pressure cooker to sort of heat this chamber, and he uses this to treat people with traumatic. They had this World War II long back, and there's a whole stock of people out there who have been traumatized by war, and so this is a sort of relief center. And I like it because it also shows the pressure cooker. And when you look at migration, but especially Indians going outside India, I call it in the book as a matter of water and steam, because you have to have the mug and the pressure cooker. So two objects without which you really can't go outside India. I'm going to end very soon. When we talk of refugees, there's a whole chapter in this book called Partitions and Displacements, in the plural. There's one big partition, 1947, but I argue that modern India is really the creation of three partitions. The partition of 1937, when Burma was taken out, the partition of 1947, and the partition of 1971, the partition of Pakistan, when Bangladesh was created. And all three have had massive sort of implications for people living along those borders, of course, but for people who've been thrown out. And it's not often realized when we talk of, say, the Syrian refugee crisis, etc., that the world's largest refugee crisis till date was the Bangladeshi refugee crisis of 1971. Okay, and most people actually went back, and India actually has had a pretty terrific record in refugee management without even signing the UN protocols. There's a whole sort of angst against that. But until very recently, India was in fact a model of what one can do with refugees. The classic example, of course, is of refugee assimilation. Of course, one is the Parsis historically. There's also a community like the Baghdadi Jews, who also found a base in Mumbai, for example. And I use this example of the Parsi and the Baghdadi Jew very carefully today, because we live in a time when we have to be very nationalist and so on. And in 1971, India won a war. And the two principal architects of that in the military was a guy called Sam Manekshaw, who was a Parsi gentleman, and a person called F.R. Jacob, who was a Baghdadi Jew. Right? And so two descendants of refugees on persecution, not actually even the Baghdadi Jews were on persecution, given enough time and healing, refugees could also win you wars. This is the sort of message that comes out with that. This particular photograph is from Burma. It looks like a partition 1947 photograph, but it's actually from much, much earlier. So there's a whole chapter in this book on also internal displacements. And when we talk of partitions, internal displacements of India quantitatively have been much more important than these big events. Right? And so whether it's dam displacement, whether it is climate-induced sort of migrations, whether it is the exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits, which we have not talked about in today's sort of discussions, 200,000, I estimate actually 120,000 based on some methods, 120,000 Kashmiri Pandits being forced to leave in the 1990s. All these movements cumulatively put together exceed 40 million since independence. And that's much more than the movements triggered by the three big partitions. Right? And so internal displacements is the big sort of big theme of involuntary migration in India much more than international. And it's interesting because often India has accorded more privileges or more rights to international refugees than people who have been displaced internally. The last chapter of this book talks about migration and development, and I look at sort of three perspectives. One being the Thackeray perspective of being a staunch nativist. One being an Ambedkarite perspective. Ambedkar loved migration. He said that's the best thing to happen. And a Gandhian perspective, which is in between. Because you'll see Gandhi loved the village republics. He hated urbanization. And he always sort of saw rural to urban migration as a problem, whereas Ambedkar saw it as the best thing possible. And so while Gandhi welcomed migration, Gandhi himself was a migrant, he takes this view which is often conflicting. That is, I'm a migrant, but it would be nice if others also, don't move. And in this book, I end by arguing that in India today, given the inequalities, one needs more migration, not less. More migration, of course, of the safer kinds, especially of social groups which have not had the privilege to move in the past. That chapter also talks about different sorts of migration. This is, by the way, a picture from R.K. Lakshman. This is probably the first thing migrants do. There's one person building a house and saying, what happened? He's an NRI, he emigrated and he's back. There's also themes of brain drain, which was very vivid in the past. Today, nobody talks about the brain drain because of the remittances that we get. But I'll end with this relationship between the exhibit outside, which is on the Siddhis, a very famous representative of that. This painting was by Jahangir. He hated, the fact that this guy was thwarting his attacks. A lot of comments on the color of his skin back then. And the institution I belong to now, I work in an institution called the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. And of all the things, we chose a logo of the Siddhi side Jali. Right? And it's from an Ethiopian community which comes to India, which still lives on, more than 50,000 Siddhis in India. It's from one of the great craftsmen from that community that India's premier management school still sort of borrows its logo. So when students sit through placement, I sort of tell them to look at this and think twice before selling fair and lovely.